Before we begin, can I remind members and witnesses to make sure their mobile phones are completely turned off, please, as they interfere with the broadcasting system behind us here. We're here today to discuss the impact of Brexit on the agri-food sector. I'd like to welcome from the Food Drink Ireland, Mr Paul Kelly, Director, and from Alcohol Beverage Federation of Ireland, Ms Patricia Cahill, Director, and Mr William Lavelle. Thank you for coming before the committee today, and also thank you for submitting your presentation previously as well. As regards the meeting process here for today, I will call on Mr Kelly first of all, and then I'll call on Ms Callan to make her presentations. Before we begin, I want to bring to your attention witnesses are protected by affidavit privilege in respect of evidence to give to the committee. However, if you are directed by the committee to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter and you continue to do so, you are entitled thereafter to qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You are directed to only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings to be given, and you are asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that, where possible, you should not criticise or make charges against any person or entity by name in such way as to make him or her identifiable. Members are reminded of long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that members should not comment on or criticise or make charges against either person outside the House and officially by name in such way as to make him or her identifiable. Mr Kelly, now I'll ask you to make your opening statement, please.
Thank you, Chairman, Deputies, Senators, ladies and gentlemen. Food Drink Ireland is part of IBEC and the main trade association for the food and drink industry in Ireland. It represents the interests of over 150 food, drink and non-food grocery manufacturers and suppliers. We welcome the opportunity to appear before the committee and would like to acknowledge the committee's ongoing focus on Brexit as it impacts on agri-food. Our submission to the committee on Brexit should be read in conjunction with the submissions from fellow IBEC associations, the Alcohol Beverage Council of Ireland, who are here today, but also Dairy Industry Ireland and Meat Industry Ireland. Looking firstly at trade flows, there has been a very strong food and drink performance in 2017, which saw overall exports increase by 11% to just over €12 billion. And within these numbers, the UK is our largest single export market. And the export exposure of various sectors within agri-food to the UK is thus high. It includes beef at 51%, dairy at 24%, but within that, half of all cheese exports go to the UK, and prepared consumer foods at 62%. But in addition to absolute exposure, there are several other factors of note. Firstly, whilst the UK as a percentage of overall exports has dropped in recent years and now stands at 35% of exports, in value terms it continues to increase and now stands at €4.5 billion, and that's a 32% increase since 2010. So this demonstrates the importance, not just now, but in the medium to long term, of maintaining our market position in what is a high value, high quality market that currently has a substantial food deficit. In value terms, Irish exposure is like that of other large exporters to the UK, and it's not surprising that they're geographically quite close by as well, countries like France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Germany and Italy. However, in percentage terms, it's 4 to 5 times higher, and typically for those countries, less than 10% of their agri-food exports are to the UK. So that, I think, clearly highlights the unique circumstances which are faced by Irish agri-food and the need for exceptional mitigation measures. It's also worth noting that total agri-food trade flows between the EU27 and the UK are €46 billion, approximately 35 billion into the UK and the balance coming out of the UK. And whilst a no-deal scenario next March will result in extensive disruption and product displacement, a future trading relationship that contains non-tariff barriers may also impact negatively on supply chains. So therefore the objective must be a trading environment that is as frictionless as possible. Looking initially then at a no-deal scenario, and in the event of such a scenario, WTO MFN tariffs could increase Irish and other EU food and drink export prices to the UK significantly after the 29th of March next year. Higher trade prices will therefore cause export volumes from the EU to the UK to drop significantly. The disruptive impact of this, combined with further currency turbulence and likely gridlock at ports, must be avoided for the sake of Irish agri-food. And if this scenario is avoided, however, there are still many important issues to consider in the future trading relationships. Just to look briefly at some of those. In relation to trade and customs challenges, currently the UK is a member of the single market, is a member of the customs union, and applies the EU common external tariff and trade policy. If any or all of these things change, there will be an impact on trade and customs. So not just if all of those things change, but if any of them change. No third country has a customs-free border with the EU, and we acknowledge the relatively low level of customs checks currently, which result from pre-authorisation of traders, advanced lodgement of declarations and an extensive system of post-clearance checks. However, a key objective in negotiating the future trading relationship with the UK must be to minimise even further the trade cost impact of customs checks by ensuring a customs relationship with as little friction as possible. The alternative is embedding additional trade costs into the business model of Irish agri-food exporters, and a large question mark over our ability to recover those costs in the marketplace. The other big issue for us is regulatory divergence. And food products, particularly those of animal origin, face additional veterinary checks as well as customs controls. There are over 2,000 EU laws affecting agri-food, and this body of law is very dynamic. This dynamism is not related just to new legislation, but also to reviews and recasts of existing regulations and directives. For example, RED II, as it's known, which is the recast of the Renewable Energy Directive, which can see substantial changes to the law. And in addition, in agri-food, food safety incidents such as the recent fipronil residues in eggs issue can often result in a policy and/or regulatory response. Finding the right approach to managing regulatory divergence of food standards between the EU and the UK will be essential for maintaining future trade as frictionless as possible. And in our view, this will require establishing a mechanism that will allow EU and UK food standards under the scope of veterinary legislation as well as under food law in general as closely aligned as possible, a mutually acceptable food inspection system regarding imports from third countries, a continued close relationship between the UK and EFSA, the European Food Safety Agency, is key in our view to continued future alignment of food standards. The objective must be continuing joint risk assessments with a common database to minimise divergence both in standards but also to avoid trade impediments, and an agreement on common rules on key drinks-related regulations, which my colleagues will touch on in more detail later. Very briefly, I would just like to mention that our submission also refers to a number of quite technical issues: rules of origin, inward and outward processing relief, and the land bridge. These are all critical, key, important issues that will need to be considered from an Irish agri-food perspective, as they will have a very major bearing on the future trading relationship. So in summary, what industry needs, the necessary measures to respond to Brexit can be summarised as follows: a transition period of sufficient duration, a comprehensive and frictionless free trading or future trading relationship, regulatory convergence, not regulatory divergence, and additional support measures for agri-food, particularly in the areas of exceptional state aid supports, market diversification and market access. And finally, I would again like to thank the committee for the opportunity to appear today and would welcome any questions that members might have.
Thanks very much, Mr. Kelly. Ms. Cahill, when you're ready.
Sure, thank you, Chairman. So the Alcohol Beverage Federation of Ireland is also part of IBEC, and we represent drinks manufacturers and distributors within the state. Unusually within IBEC, though, we are an all-island trade body, so we also represent member companies in the north of Ireland and in the south, so 48 companies in total. We have 5 category trade associations, and they look after category-specific issues, including the Irish Brewers Association, cider, spirits, whisky and wine associations. As I said, we operate on an integrated all-island basis, so it's not just the companies operating either side of the border, but we have a particularly entwined sector in terms of the production process and supply chains. We also have, very importantly, 3 cross-border geographic indications, and what that means is that Irish whisky, Irish cream and poutine are protected by the EU in a similar manner to champagne, in that they can only be made in the origin of Ireland, just like champagne can only be made in Champagne. So it's very important for us, and the reason we're seeing such investment, particularly into Irish whisky distilleries. We had 4 distilleries in 2014. We now have 21 operational, 22 in the coming weeks, and a further 26 in planning, is that protection globally means that your investment is much stronger. And what we're seeing is a rise in fake product being sold in third markets, with the rise of Irish whisky as the fastest growing spirits category in the world. So it's very important in these discussions, and it was welcome to see in the withdrawal agreement that protection will be replicated by the UK, because we will rely on both jurisdictions to help us enforce that. So that's a very particular focus for us. You'll all have received already our position paper, Brexit and the Irish drinks industry, where we're really focusing on the future priorities, the future relationship. And obviously that's against the presumption still today that we will end up with an agreement and not a no deal. In terms of the sector, €1.6 billion of drinks exports are exported from the island of Ireland, with €1.2 billion coming from the Republic. And according to the CSO, we also have a very strong trade in drinks products between Ireland and the UK in 2017. That was 364 million, one-third of which is the aggregate value of North-South trade. So particularly for the all-island economy, the spirit sector in the north of Ireland is actually a very big part of their economy. Fundamentally, some of the practical issues we're facing from a food safety perspective, the integrity of glass is essential for our products, and we import over 130 million glass bottles, which again, if in the event of no deal, you'd end up having a tariff. We're also seeing businesses stockpile, so there are already shortages being experienced in terms of those core products. In a very practical sense, we physically cross the border with 23,000 truck movements each year. 5,000 of those are alcohol tanker movements, so product can be made in one part of the jurisdiction and then bottled in another. And again, a lot of that is due to the growth that the industry investment in terms of capacity is growing so strongly. We're using bottling sites right around the country. So we're obviously watching very closely the vote in the House of Commons, and we've been liaising directly with the British Government and our Northern Ireland counterparts representing our Northern Irish members. And it's our view essentially that whilst it's not perfect, the withdrawal agreement certainly represents the best possible approach to Brexit. Our view is that a no deal would be seriously damaging to the Irish and UK economies, including our sector. Some of the potential consequences: the lack of continuity and legal protection for our cross-border geographic indicators in the UK is obviously a very key priority. We'd also see immediate tariffs on raw agricultural product, things like cream, barley, malt, apples, also on glass bottles, as I mentioned, and on finished cider and other supply chain inputs, and that would obviously have a cost implication. In terms of regulatory and custom checks at the Irish border, we're very cognizant of the fact that each delay essentially of a truck of an hour costs €100. But more importantly than even just physical products checks, we also have excise and VAT to look at. So if we move to a situation of VAT at point of entry, that would mean massive cash flow implications for businesses. And in terms of excise, currently we have a very sophisticated excise control movement right around the EU. If the UK does not replicate that, then that poses very serious challenges that we'd have to pay excise whilst going across borders and also a lot more physical checks. And also we're going to see regulatory divergence across a range of standards, both from labelling to bottle sizes, and the benefit of being in this EU market is obviously that those sorts of costs are reduced for businesses. So I think from our perspective, the adoption of the withdrawal agreement is actually the surest way to avoid that, and that's certainly what we want to avoid. I think the government and the state agencies have done a tremendous job here. Certainly members in the north certainly have had nowhere near the amount of support, education, awareness and proactivity the likes of Borbia, Enterprise Ireland, the Revenue and Intertrade Ireland have provided down here, and that's certainly been really important. But unfortunately, because of historical listings within the European Investment Bank, so far distilleries, spirits producers have not been able to access the Brexit loan schemes that the government introduced. Now, certainly the one last year was completely prohibited because European investment funding was involved, and they blacklist the spirits category. We understand the government have been working very hard to ensure that their future growth loan scheme, the one announced in this year's budget, will actually be available to members, and obviously that's something that we look forward to a satisfactory resolution to. I think it's also important point to make is that we tremendously benefit from all of the EU free trade agreements globally. And Scotch whisky, as a key element of that, has been very important to the drink sector being right at the heart of a lot of those agreements, because we're a massive exporter cumulatively. So we're cognizant of the fact that once they're outside of those free trade agreements, Irish whisky and Irish cream will be the second and third biggest exports in this sector. And we really need to work very hard to ensure that the EU continues to prioritise us in free trade agreements. For example, the recent EU agreement with Canada abolished outstanding tariffs on Irish cream liqueur and Irish gin, and following Minister Screed's trade mission, which my colleague William Lavelle was on, we saw from this controlled alcohol state, all alcohol is bought by the state in Canada, that they have issued specific tenders, and a lot of our smaller members, for example in Irish Gin, are getting listed, and it's a fantastic boost to them. So it's working really well for us, and we certainly are very positive about global trade agreements, and have been inputting with European colleagues around the potential agreements in Australia, New Zealand, Vietnam and the Mercosur. And we're cognizant that in these debates, obviously colleagues across the food sector and different sectors might have different opinions, but for us these are very, very positive, and certainly we would look, given that we're already in 140 markets globally, we want to expand that ever more. So I think free trade agreements, however, don't necessarily just increase exports. We also need to be upskilling our companies. And as has been said by many sectors, specifically in our industry, cider has the greatest exposure to the UK. 85% of all cider products produced in Ireland are exported to the UK, 71% of all beer exports. So those are the two areas that we really need to focus in terms of product diversification into new markets. And that's through direct supports like participation in trade shows, but also traditionally we've had supports for sales and marketing staff in international markets. So feet on the ground is absolutely essential to growing brands and having global brand ambassadors, and we'd like to see more investment by the government in that. We'd also like to see more effective and robust market intelligence, not only about demographics in countries, but what are our competitors doing, where the opportunities lie, and certainly that's something the state can assist us with. And certainly category promotion, again, trade missions, absolutely vital to build in a drinks element into every trade mission that any of the ministers are doing. That would be really important to us. So finally, just as we all know, it's not just about tariffs in terms of trade restrictions. Quite often, the issue of technical barriers to trade is equally important. And one of the key areas in the EU where we've moved to harmonise is around the issue of labelling. But recently, the Irish government has sought to introduce a barrier to trade, indeed one that creates regulatory divergence on this island, north and south, by introducing country-only labels for Ireland under the Public Health Alcohol Act. Certainly, this measure will deter small beer, cider, wine, spirits producers from exporting to Ireland, including the Northern Irish gin producers, for whom Ireland is one of their major markets, but the costs will be substantial. So I think it is important that we look at that and seek to implement it in as best and practical way as possible. And we have asked the Minister for Health to establish an implementation group on that, and would certainly welcome your support in that. So I'd like to thank you all for the opportunity to make this submission, and certainly if you have any questions, we look forward to answering them.
Thank you very much, Ms Callan. Members now will take Senator Conway Walsh first of all.
I thank you very much for your presentations. I think they're very useful, both from a technical point of view and a tariff point of view in terms of what the cost of Brexit is likely to be. But throughout all of that, you commend Board BA Enterprise Ireland, the Revenue Commissioners and the Government and Intertrade Ireland for being prepared and for the work that they have done. So are they prepared for a no-deal Brexit? That's my question.
Okay, I'll take a couple of questions together. Is that all right? Senator Daly.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks for the presentations. And I suppose at this stage, where we are on the Brexit thing, we're only talking about it here really, unless you're in the House of Commons over the next 7 days. We can talk until the cows come home. But just a couple of questions based on the presentations, and it's a follow-on as such to Senator Conway Walsh's question. In the individual companies that you represent, the state bodies, state agencies aside, what contingency plans are being put in place and what actions are being taken with a view to whatever all, I suppose, eventual outcomes of next week's proceedings in the UK and further down the line. And then also just what insulations have the companies got for a mad fluctuation in sterling, which, depending on, irrespective of the outcome, it's basically how the markets will read the outcome in a trading basis. And a lot of Irish companies, while there might be no barriers, no divergence, if sterling goes on a mad spiral up and down, how are your companies insulated and how does it affect them? And how do the companies that are working, say, in conjunction with each other cross-border while they're in two separate currency jurisdictions, how are they working so well together? from an export, as in all Ireland. I suppose it's more to the drinks industry who are seem to be working more as an all-island outfit at the moment, but it is an island with two distinct different currencies. So how is that working now, and how could that affect your trading going forward post-Brexit?
Thanks, Senator. Deputy Pringle, do you indicate?
No, I didn't actually, but that's okay, Jim. Well, I mean, we're talking really, we don't know what's going to happen, and that's the reality of the situation. So we can talk away about a no-deal Brexit, or what the deal is on next week, and decide everything's great there, and then all of a sudden that's gone. So I don't know. I think we're really talking in the vacuum. The one problem I have is, I mean, you're supposed to represent the same organisation, basically. So, I mean, this is more for the committee. I wonder about, one presentation would do from the same organisation, I think, here, and that's no reflection on yourselves out there, but I mean, it's basically what we have, and in fairness to yourselves, you've said it, we don't know what's going to happen, so we're talking really just guesswork here at the moment. It looks like the deal is going to fall, and so what's the implications for that? Can you plan for that? You don't know, because another deal could be put in place, and all that planning go haywire. So it's just.
Was planning for the worst and hoping for the best?
Well, the plan for the worst and hoping for the best means that you have to have about 10 plans, and you don't know which plan you're going to use. So you don't know which plan is going to work. So you don't. How do you invest in? Do you invest in all your plans? That's very difficult for anybody. So I don't know what can. So that's it.
Okay. Just a question for myself, for both of you. But do you see a reduction of investment in recent times because of the uncertainty within your industry because of Brexit? Would you see? That's a straightforward answer, obviously. Would you think that will take a while before that may stabilise, where industry might say, "Okay, we're safe enough to go ahead"?
I think once there's certainty, from a business planning perspective, once there's certainty, that significantly reduces the risk, and that allows decisions to be made much more easily. There isn't that level of certainty there at the moment.
Whatever the certainty is, once there's certainty.
Well, I suppose then maybe just to touch on maybe one or two of your points there, Deputy. There's really essentially two sort of broad scenarios. One will be sort of a no deal, or alternatively there will be a deal and we'll see a movement into a transition and the discussions around the future trading relationship. So I think from our perspective we need to address both. I take your point that there's a huge amount of uncertainty and things are literally changing on a daily basis, particularly in Westminster. But what was agreed in Brussels there recently was two things: the withdrawal deal, but also the political declaration on the future trading relationship. They're going to get to that at some point or other, hopefully relatively soon. It's only a political declaration at this stage. That's going to turn into some form of free trade agreement or some sort of agreement between two parties, EU 27 and the UK. And that's why when we're looking at sort of the medium to longer term aspects of this, we feel it's hugely important to be thinking about these issues, to be talking about these issues, and to be focused on those issues, because over the longer term, the outcome of that is going to lock in our trading relationship with, from an agri-food perspective, what is and what will most likely remain to be our most important trading partner. And if we don't get things right around things like customs, if we don't get things right around things like the regulatory relationship, that's going to embed costs into our business model for the long term. So it's hugely important that we look at those. So there is a degree of certainty in the sense that that's going to happen at some stage or other. So it's important for us to focus on that to a certain extent. From the immediate perspective, huge amount of uncertainty, very difficult from an investment perspective, and from a business perspective in terms of contingency planning, and I think from the state agencies as well. And I think maybe just to answer the various questions from the Senator and the Deputy, there's a certain amount that can be done in terms of contingency planning for a no-deal Brexit. In some respects, companies are gone past the point of no return, and you could probably say the same in relation to the state agencies as well. You know, in terms of, you know, additional veterinary inspectors, in terms of additional customs officials and so on, that in theory would be needed. You know, you can't just recruit somebody and put them in situ. There's training and so on that's required. There's physical infrastructure that needs to be put in place. I think what's quite clear is that the agencies are very much working towards December 2020 to be fully up to speed on that. But I would imagine that there will be emergency measures needed in the event of a no deal on the 29th of March. From a company perspective, again, they've done all the plans, as Patricia mentioned there. They've outlined all the various scenarios. The big issue for companies is, with this level of uncertainty, the sort of investments that would be required to make sure that your home done and dusted on the 29th of March simply don't make business sense for most businesses. So they'll be doing what they can do where there's little or no cost, but if there's substantial investments involved, most companies, I think, are not in a position to do that, particularly in low margin businesses like food and drink.
Ms. Cahill?
Sure. So in terms of, is the government and its agencies prepared for no deal? Absolutely not. They're very clear they're planning for the central case scenario in terms of having that transition. And it's certainly, even in my last engagement with the Department of Agriculture, I challenged that because I think that's bad. The idea that our revenue commissioners have absolutely no plan for customs on this island. All the focus has been on east-west because the basic presumption is it won't happen. We've got political agreement, it'll all be sorted. We think it would only be responsible to have done some sort of analysis, but their official positions, they've done nothing. That's what they've told us. So that would mean that you would be at a cliff edge on the 29th of March, and no one can plan for that. So I think, you know, again, people have to focus where you're putting your resources, and logically, you're listening to all the mood messages and going, oh, well, sure, this couldn't possibly happen. But if it does, then you'd have to see really dramatic decisions, because you can't have everything in place across all the sectors and all the regulation, everything else. You'd have to have some sort of keep it going for a while, do less inspections, etc. In terms of our members' contingency planning, everyone is taking this very seriously. I think bigger companies have spent a lot of money, done very detailed case scenarios around supply chains and such like, all with a view to making sure that everything is seamless and has as little impact as possible on the consumer. I think also, don't just think negatively. I think businesses who are UK based are also looking, well, where we supply from? So there might be some upsides in this, in the context that joint shipments to third countries of Scotch and Irish whisky, now Irish goes to Scotland, they're packaged there and sent out. It might make more sense to turn that around and to look to do that from here. So in really practical sense, we brought members in one by one into the Department of Agriculture to work through their specific issues, and it's at the level of the port. People want to know the Dublin port's going to work. They want to understand where are going to be the tracking systems, what are going to be the lanes, who's going to be prioritised. It's all those sorts of questions the companies are asking, very granular stuff. And that's been a really interesting process, and certainly the companies have found it very, very helpful to get that level of detail. And equally, we've been into Task Force 50 twice in the last 5 weeks, working through very detailed stuff around excise and how that will all work. But bearing in mind, again, the UK government is also very late to this. Our very first meeting on excise with them was about 6 weeks ago. So, you know, there is no level of planning, but certainly we found very good engagement, and people have a really good understanding, I think, of our issues. But my worry is that if we keep going on unknown, businesses do have to make decisions. They can't just adopt the wait-and-see approach. So you might find that people will just, as I say, they're already stockpiling, warehouses are full, etc., and that's across retail as well as in our industry. But then you'll see, because all that advance buying has happened, you'll see knock-on implications for both the Irish and UK economies when all that rolls itself out, because we've advanced both, so what happens? And then you have really practical issues then in terms of just physical movements and planning for that. So you might see people just say, well, look, I've had enough of this, and I'm going to just go and hedge my bets one way or the other in either jurisdiction, north or south in our case as well. So I think government needs to up its communications about the detail. We hear about how many jobs are going into departments and agencies, but we don't really hear about how that's going to help us as businesses, even though we know obviously that's essential as well, and the protection of the food supply chain and safety and all of that is critical.
And sorry,
Yeah.
your level of engagement with the department, for example, at the moment, is that weekly, monthly?
Well, we've had, they have a stakeholder group of all of us that don't meet all that often, but we've brought in companies one by one, so we've seen them quite regularly over the last while. But we felt that was a better approach because businesses can't share confidential information with each other. So to get to nitty-gritty, really practical insights, you have to do that, and the department were willing to do that, which is really helpful. In terms of currencies, again, most of our guys, we deal in 140 markets, so in that sense, even our smaller companies are much better prepared to deal with things like that than the food sector, which is much more low margin, but we would have very sophisticated modelling around all of that and hedging instruments and such like, but obviously, if it's a free-for-all chaotic, no one can plan for that, and we would certainly see a hit. But I think again we're in relatively good stead there. I think in terms of our organisation, just to explain the difference between ourselves, we do have some members in common, but all of our smaller companies wouldn't be in IBEC; they'd be in the Small Firms Association, which is also part of IBEC, and our northern members are only in us. So it is that broader perspective that we're bringing in. Thank you again for the opportunity to come. But in terms of investment, I think actually, again, we have seen huge investment into the drink sector in Ireland, and that's purely because people believe in the product. They believe in our capacity to be the fastest growing spirit in the world. So to build a distillery costs 15, 25 million, 50 million in the case of one of the more recent announcements. You have another 5 million to mature the stock, and then you need as much again in marketing and sales. So the geographic indicators, the belief that we have top-notch product that is making traction in global markets, and that's why we're continuing to see the money invest there. But certainly, that's why I say, in terms of, from our perspective, the greater threat is something like the Public Health Alcohol Act than Brexit in reality. And obviously also the US trade war. So in the space of 2.5 weeks, we went from steel tariffs to tariffs on bourbon and whiskey, which is still a 25% tariff on imported product here, with the threat that the US will retaliate against us at any time. Now, if they hit us with a 25% tariff, 50% of Irish cream and Irish whiskey goes to the US, then it's much more dramatic for us than Brexit. But I think we're very clear about the issues. We need people to work with us at that granular level. And high politics is all well and good, but we now need to get into the detail, I think.
Okay, with regard to targets, obviously very ambitious targets, and that's been the good news story over the past, I suppose, 6, 7, 10 years. The growth, as you mentioned, the growth of the craft breweries, the distilleries, and so on and so forth. And you mentioned there's 2 or 3 more coming on stream next number of weeks. Have you had to review your targets within an industry with regard to where we are now at the moment?
I think for spirits, again, the focus is away from the UK, so they're fine, but certainly in terms of cider and beer, the production process, even if you take the likes, 85% of the finished product goes to the UK in terms of cider, but also the vast majority of apples that are used in that process are grown north of the border. So if you've got a tariff on apples coming in and you've got a tariff on your final product going out, then you've got some very serious and difficult questions. And that's the type of product then you need to be looking to diversify and, if necessary, moving manufacturing accordingly.
Like with 85% of cider going to the UK, it obviously presents a huge difficulty potentially going forward. Yeah. You know, that's a whole industry more or less that could potentially be under threat.
Absolutely, it is, and they have very serious considerations to make, and indeed with many food companies, it depends on where your market actually is and whether you can diversify. But for most businesses, they approach this not from diversify. They approach from it. The UK is a very profitable market. We're very ingrained there. How do we protect what we have? How do we grow that market? And then the question would be, where do we want to supply that from? Whereas I think the difference in spirits with the geographic indicators is there's no option. You have to make it on the island of Ireland. There's a unique protection there, and that's why the legal and laws around that are really the most important thing for us.
With regard to the cider industry, have they looked to other markets other than the UK? Obviously they have.
Yeah, and again, and the craft beer sector as well have had great success in more recent years. But again, it's always going to be more costly, and then our concern, again, going back to the ports, is if everyone is competing for the space and there's only a certain amount, and obviously as has been outlined to us, the Irish government is more concerned about imports because that's our duty rather than exports. Now, they're very business-minded and they say, well, that's because so to make sure it's not clogged up for our exports. But fundamentally, the Irish government's responsibility is about managing imports and its responsibilities in terms of customs and veterinary checks and all of that sort of thing. But we certainly need to know, and I think at that point you'd be looking at, well, look, if we need to get product off this small island because we're an exporting nation, how do we up our subvention in terms of new routes, in terms of ferries? And that could be that initially it might be that the government would have to subsidise that as an emergency measure because there might not be enough freight in and of itself, but you'd need to carve out those new routes and the infrastructure to go with that.
Okay.
Just
Senator Daly.
a brief question, Chair, just to follow up. You represented, say, All Ireland, and you're kind of concentrating most there on the spirits. If we're talking, like, if it's a hard Brexit, as the chairman said, we're planning for the worst here and hoping for the best. Can you compare what your role will be with Bushmills and Kilbeggan if there was a hard Brexit in the morning?
So I have responsibility for the Irish Whisky Association within ABFI. So we represent 35 companies, north and south. Obviously, we have very historic distilleries right across the country, Middleton, Kilbeggan in this jurisdiction, Bushmills in the north. But overall, actually, we also have a number of smaller distilleries coming on stream in Northern Ireland. There will be a very different approach having to be taken, north and south, in representing the interests of those companies. At present, all Irish whisky producers are within the EU, and they're all benefiting equally, for example, from access to EU free trade agreements, which have been very significant in opening up new market opportunities around the world. Going forward, producers in Northern Ireland, at a certain stage, immediately if there was a no deal, and possibly at a later stage post-transition, may not have access to those same free trade options. So we're going to have a dual trade policy function in engaging on behalf of our members in this jurisdiction through the EU Commission and engaging with the Department of International Trade in London in respect of Northern Ireland trade. And indeed, I think one of the biggest challenges of Brexit for our members in Northern Ireland will be that issue of the loss of access to EU free trade agreements. I think EU free trade agreements have been significant in opening up exports and actually turning the Northern Irish economy around from being a closed regional economy to an open, globalised economy. And that is one of the biggest threats we face. And as a North-South body, we will have to take up that dual function in, I suppose, representing members both in Brussels and in London on trade policy. And that, I think, is one of the biggest implications we'll face.
Mr. Lavelle, Senator Colin Walsh.
Thank you. So really, if we could be facing a perfect storm in terms of the food and drink industry and everybody employed in it, if we're to have the double whammy in particular of Brexit and then the increased tariffs from America with very serious consequences. So no products in the north of Ireland are allowed to use product of Ireland on their labelling. Is that right?
At present, products both north and south are labelled product of Ireland. There is a question. It's at present, so spirits will do that. Going forward, there is a question mark over that. If you look at the withdrawal agreement and the backstop, it would require products in Northern Ireland to be labelled product of UK, Northern Ireland. And obviously, from an Irish whisky point of view, we'd have a concern about that. We'd far prefer to be product of Northern Ireland, and I know our producers in the north would feel that way too. The word Irish is protected in terms of Irish whisky. Irish whisky is a very defined category, as I say, the fastest growing spirits category in the world. And obviously we want to protect the Irish identity of that. But that is very much an issue which can be dealt with in terms of the future relationship negotiations. I mean, that is just one issue within a withdrawal agreement, which overall we believe is the best approach to Brexit. And indeed, there are many issues here. The backstop might never come into play. There might be that agreement put in place before an extended transition. So obviously the focus now, and I suppose representing our businesses in Northern Ireland, is to express support for the withdrawal agreement. A no deal would be something we really want to avoid. So we could hope that early in the new year we'd be in a position to move on from withdrawal agreement to looking at that future relationship. And that's why the ABFI position paper, which was published in October, is very much priorities for the future relationship. We really want to get into those discussions and make sure that companies both in this jurisdiction and in the north can get the best possible deal, not from this agreement but from the next agreement.
Because it's very obvious that partition doesn't serve the food and drinks industry in any kind of positive way.
Well, I think just to say, I mean, our industry has existed very successfully from the days when we were all part of the British Empire through to now, and it will continue to succeed. We've been through the ebbs and flows of all the constitutional machinations. Look, Irish whiskey will survive, Irish cream, Irish beer will survive Brexit. There are challenges there, but we have to overcome those challenges, and it won't be easy, but that's our job.
When you talk about a joint committee on cross-border geographical indications, how would you see that working?
Well, I think already the withdrawal agreement provides for a number of EU-UK withdrawal agreements. Obviously, the issue of the 3 cross-border spirits geographic indications are unique within the EU because it'll be the only 3 geographic indications of about 3,000, if you take everything from Italian cheeses to Parma ham to champagne. The 3 Irish spirits GIs will be unique in that they will cross borders. So we believe that there is a definite need for close cooperation, and already that cooperation exists. So the Department of Agriculture is the competent authority in this jurisdiction. HMRC and DEFRA are the competent authorities in the UK. There's already very close cooperation in relation to the application and enforcement of the GI. We want to ensure that will continue, and we would hope that as part of an agreement, and I suppose there will be a whole architecture and infrastructure of joint committees, there should be a specific joint committee looking at the GIs, given their unique cross-border status.
Let others in. Thanks.
Okay, any other members wish to comment before we wrap up? Okay, that concludes, I suppose, our presentation for today. I'd like to thank Ms Callan, Mr Lavelle and Mr Kelly for coming forward for me today, and previously as well. As you know, this committee was the first committee to produce a report on the effects of Brexit on the whole agriculture sector, and as we all know, it's moving on a regular basis and daily basis, hourly basis to a certain extent. So our intention was obviously to update our previous report, which we hope to do now before Christmas, and we'll obviously see how things transpire over the next number of weeks as well. Hopefully we won't be planning for the worst case scenario, but I do think we have to look down that road as well, and our report will probably indicate that when we produce it before Christmas. So again, thank you for coming before the committee and your presentations, and as a no further business, meeting is adjourned until next Tuesday, the 11th of December at 3:30. Thank you very much, everybody.